He offered his maid's daughter 3 wishes like it was nothing more than an amusing afternoon diversion. But her first wish wasn't about a mansion or a mountain of cash. It was a mirror held up to his soul, one that would reveal the emptiness beneath all his wealth. He was a man who possessed everything money could buy, whose signature could move markets and whose time was worth more per minute than most people earned in a week. Yet he was desperately hollow inside. She was the 10-year-old girl who cleaned dishes in his kitchen, a silent witness who noticed that his charitable smile never warmed the ice in his steel-colored eyes. In a moment of prideful generosity, the billionaire offered his maid's daughter 3 wishes, expecting her to request dolls or perhaps a trip to an amusement park. But this girl had just watched him deny her mother a small loan for an aching tooth, right after he'd publicly announced a $5 million donation on television. She wouldn't waste her wishes on trivial things. She would demand something revolutionary, an impossible request that would corner the billionaire and force him to witness what he had truly become and the transformation he was about to undergo. And before I forget, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Leave a comment below letting me know your city and country. And with that, let's get to the story. The morning sunlight cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like blades of gold, illuminating every corner of Richard Calloway's pristine world. The apartment stretched across the entire 48th floor, a palace suspended in the sky above the city. Everything here spoke of money, not just wealth, but the kind of fortune that bends reality to its will. The marble floors came from quarries in Italy that only opened once every 5 years. The paintings on the walls weren't reproductions, they were originals worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. The furniture had been designed specifically for this space by architects whose waiting lists stretched years into the future. Richard stood at the window, dressed in a suit that cost more than a car, holding a cup of coffee made from beans so rare they were harvested only from a single mountain in Ethiopia. He was 42 years old, tall and commanding, with dark hair touched with distinguished gray at the temples. His face was handsome in that calculated way that came from expensive grooming, personal trainers, and the best cosmetic procedures money could quietly buy. But his eyes, those pale gray eyes, held nothing behind them. They were like windows to an empty room. He was on the phone, his third call of the morning, and it was barely 7 o'clock. His voice carried that particular tone wealthy men use when they're pretending to care about something. Smooth, practiced, hollow. "Yes, Jennifer, I think the Children's Hospital is the perfect recipient for this quarter's donation," he said, watching his reflection in the window as he spoke. "5 million should cover the new wing they need. Make sure the press conference is scheduled for Thursday. I want maximum coverage. The Wall Street Journal, Forbes, all the major outlets. This needs to be visible." He listened for a moment, nodding at his own reflection. "Perfect, and make sure my speech mentions my commitment to helping those less fortunate. Use that exact phrase, it polls well with the demographic we're targeting." He paused, then added, "Also, I'll need the children there, the sick ones, but not too sick, Jennifer. I don't want anyone dying on camera or looking too depressing. Find some who can smile and look grateful, it plays better." He ended the call without saying goodbye and set his phone on the counter with a soft click. Behind him, moving so quietly she might have been a ghost, was Patricia Miller. She was his live-in housekeeper, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes and hands that were always working. She wore a simple gray uniform that Richard insisted upon, though he'd never actually looked at her long enough to see if it fit properly. It didn't. It was too big in some places and too tight in others, but Patricia had learned long ago that complaining about such things was pointless. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, wiping down counters that were already spotless, organizing items that didn't need organizing, doing the invisible work that kept Richard's world running smoothly. He never noticed her, not really. She was like the marble floors or the expensive coffee maker, just another object that served its purpose without requiring acknowledgement. What Richard didn't know, what he'd never bothered to notice, was that Patricia brought her daughter to work with her 3 mornings a week. The girl's name was Lily and she was 10 years old. Patricia couldn't afford childcare and Lily's school didn't start until 9, so the girl would sit quietly in the kitchen doing homework at a small table in the corner, so still and silent that Richard had walked past her dozens of times without ever registering her presence. Lily was a thin child with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing clothes that were clean but clearly hand-me-downs. She had her mother's tired eyes, but there was something else there too, something sharp and observant. While her mother cleaned, Lily watched. She watched Richard pace while making his calls. She watched him throw away food that could have fed her family for a week. She watched him ignore her mother's good morning every single day. And she watched that very morning something that would change everything. Richard's phone rang again and he answered it with irritation. "What is it, Patricia? I'm busy." But it wasn't Patricia calling. She was standing right there in the kitchen, her phone in her hand, her face pale. She'd just hung up from a call of her own. "Mr. Calloway," she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "I apologize for interrupting, but I need to ask you something important." Richard turned, actually looking at her for perhaps the first time in months. He looked annoyed. "This better be quick, I have a meeting in 20 minutes. Patricia swallowed hard, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "Sir, I know this is difficult timing, but I just got a call from the dentist. I have an infection in one of my teeth and it's got much worse. They say if I don't get it treated this week, it could become dangerous. The procedure costs $800 and I don't have it. I was wondering if perhaps I could get an advance on my salary just this once. I'll work extra hours, I promise. I'll do anything." Richard stared at her as if she just asked him to fly to the moon. His face showed clear distaste, the kind of expression someone makes when they've discovered something unpleasant on the bottom of their expensive shoe. "Patricia, we've discussed this before," he said coldly. "I don't do salary advances, it's a policy. If I make an exception for you, then everyone will want exceptions. That's not how businesses operate, even household businesses. You're paid more than fairly for your work." "But sir," Patricia's voice cracked slightly and Lily watched her mother's hands tremble. "It's a medical emergency. The dentist said the infection could spread. I've been taking pain medication for 2 weeks, but it's not helping anymore. I just need this one advance. I've worked here for 3 years without ever asking for anything." Richard's expression didn't change. If anything, it grew colder. "That's your problem to solve, Patricia, not mine. Have you considered going to a free clinic, or perhaps you could cut back on unnecessary expenses? I'm sure you're wasting money somewhere. Most people in your position do." He glanced at his watch, a timepiece that cost more than Patricia made in a year. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important matters to attend to." He walked past her without another word, leaving Patricia standing in the kitchen with tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She turned away quickly, not wanting her daughter to see her cry, but Lily had seen everything. The 10-year-old girl had watched the entire exchange with those sharp, observant eyes. What Richard didn't know was that Lily had also been watching television that morning while doing her homework. She'd watched her mother's employer, dressed in a different expensive suit, standing in front of cameras and microphones, announcing his $5 million donation to the children's hospital. She'd watched him smile that empty smile and talk about his deep commitment to helping those in need. She'd watched him pose for pictures with sick children, placing his hand on their shoulders with practiced compassion. And now, not 20 minutes later, she'd watched that same man refuse to help her mother with $800 to save her from a dangerous infection. Lily didn't say anything, not yet. She simply went back to her homework, but something had changed behind those watchful eyes. Something had crystallized into understanding. The day continued like any other day in Richard Calloway's world. He went to his meetings. He made his deals. He returned home that evening to find his dinner prepared and waiting, the apartment spotless, everything in perfect order. Patricia served his meal with the same quiet efficiency she always did, though her face was drawn with pain and one side of her jaw was visibly swollen. Richard ate his dinner while reading emails on his tablet, never once looking up to see the woman who'd prepared his food. Never once noticing that she was pressing her hand against her face to try to ease the throbbing pain. Never once caring that the person who maintained his entire life was suffering. After dinner, he settled into his leather chair in the living room with a glass of whiskey that cost more per bottle than Patricia's monthly salary. He was feeling particularly pleased with himself. The press conference had gone well. The media coverage was excellent. His public image was stronger than ever. He was thinking about all of this when he noticed, for the first time, that there was a child in his apartment. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table, visible through the open doorway, working on something with intense concentration. Richard frowned. He didn't like disruptions to his environment. Children were disruptions. "Patricia," he called out, his voice sharp, "is that a child in my kitchen?" Patricia appeared quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, sir, that's my daughter, Lily. She comes with me some mornings before school. I apologize if she's been a disturbance. She's always very quiet." Richard studied the girl through the doorway. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him, just kept working on whatever she was doing. Something about that irritated him more than if she'd been noisy. It made him feel invisible in his own home. "She can stay this evening," he said dismissively, "but keep her quiet." Then, perhaps because he was in such a good mood from his successful day, or perhaps because he wanted to feel magnanimous, or perhaps simply because he was bored and the child represented a momentary amusement, Richard did something completely out of character. He walked to the kitchen doorway and actually addressed the girl directly. "Hello there," he said, using the tone adults use when they're trying to sound friendly to children but don't actually know how. "What's your name?" Lily looked up slowly, and for the first time Richard found himself the subject of those sharp, observant eyes. It was oddly uncomfortable the way she looked at him, like she could see through him. "Lily," she said simply. "Well, Lily," Richard said, warming to his role as the generous benefactor, "I had a very good day today. I helped a lot of sick children by donating money to their hospital. It's important for wealthy people like me to give back, to help those who are less fortunate." He paused, enjoying the sound of his own virtue. "In fact, I'm feeling so generous that I'm going to make you a special offer. I'm going to grant you 3 wishes just like in a fairy tale. Anything you want, within reason of course. What do you think about that?" Patricia had frozen in place, her eyes wide with alarm. She knew her daughter. She knew that sharp intelligence. She knew what Lily had witnessed that morning. "Lily, honey, Mr. Calloway is very busy. You don't need to." But Richard held up his hand, silencing her. "No, no, I offered. I'm a man of my word." He smiled at Lily, that practiced public smile. "So, little girl, what would you like? A new toy, maybe a bicycle? I could even arrange a trip to Disney World if you'd like. What do you say?" The room became very still. Patricia's hands clutched her apron. Richard stood there with his empty smile, waiting to feel the warm glow of childish gratitude, and Lily, 10-year-old Lily, sat at that table looking at the man who owned everything and saw nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying none of the excitement Richard had expected. Instead, it carried something else entirely, something that made the air in the room feel heavier. "I have 3 wishes," she asked. "That's right," Richard said, his smile widening. "3 wishes, anything you want." Lily looked at her mother, then back at Richard. "And you promise to grant them, no matter what they are?" "Within reason," Richard said, already starting to regret his impulsive offer. There was something about the way she was looking at him that made him uneasy. "And what's within reason?" Lily pressed. Richard laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. "Well, you can't wish for $1 million or anything ridiculous like that, but for a reasonable request from a child, yes, I'll grant it. I'm a very generous man after all." Lily nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. Then she said 6 words that would shatter Richard Calloway's entire world. "Okay, I know my first wish." "Wonderful," Richard said, still smiling. "What would you like?" Lily folded her hands on the table in front of her, and when she looked up at him, there was something ancient in those young eyes. Something that knew pain and injustice and the weight of watching someone you love suffer while someone else throws away money like confetti. "My first wish," she said clearly, "is that for 1 full week you have to live as someone who makes minimum wage. You can't use any of your money or your connections or your name. You have to live in a small apartment like we do, work a real job with your hands, and try to survive on what normal people make. You have to see what it's really like to be one of the people you claim to help. That's my first wish." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's smile disappeared as if it had never existed. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally something that might have been fear. "That's not a reasonable wish," he said, his voice tight. "I meant toys or treats or—" "You promised," Lily said, her voice still calm. "You said 3 wishes for anything within reason. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for anything that costs you anything except time and experience. You told me you help people who are less fortunate. My wish is that you actually understand what that means. That sounds reasonable to me. Does it sound reasonable to you, Mr. Calloway?" Patricia had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and horror. "Lily, please." But Richard held up his hand again, this time not in generous dismissal but in shock. He stared at this 10-year-old girl who had somehow impossibly trapped him with his own words. He'd made the offer in front of her mother. He'd announced himself as a man of his word. And she'd asked for something that was, technically, completely reasonable. Nothing illegal, nothing impossible, just uncomfortable. Devastatingly, terrifyingly uncomfortable. He could refuse, he should refuse. He was Richard Calloway. He didn't have to explain himself to anyone, least of all a child. But as he stood there, looking at those unflinching eyes, he realized something that chilled him. If he refused, if he backed down from this promise made to a 10-year-old girl, what did that make him? Not just in her eyes or her mother's eyes, but in his own. He'd built his entire public image on being a man of integrity, a man who kept his word, a man who cared about those less fortunate. And now a child had called his bluff in the most devastating way possible. "You really want this as your first wish?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Lily said firmly. "Why?" The question escaped him before he could stop it. Lily looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, every word landed like a stone in still water. Because this morning you told my mother that $800 to fix her infected tooth was too much to ask for. You told her to go to a free clinic and to stop wasting money. And then not even an hour before that, I watched you on television giving away $5 million and talking about how much you care about helping people in need. I want you to see what need really looks like. I want you to understand what it means to count every dollar and still not have enough. That's why. Richard felt something crack inside his chest, something he didn't have a name for because he'd never felt it before. It might have been shame. One week he heard himself say the words coming out before he'd fully decided to speak them. One week and then this debt is paid, your first wish will be granted. Lily nodded, satisfied. Thank you, Mr. Calloway, when would you like to start? Richard looked around his penthouse at all his expensive things, at the life he'd built that suddenly felt less like an achievement and more like a prison. He thought about refusing again, about laughing this off and sending the child and her mother away. But he didn't. Monday, he said, his voice hollow. I'll start Monday. And as he walked back to his study, leaving the kitchen behind, Richard Calloway had no idea that he'd just agreed to the most transformative week of his life. He had no idea that this 10-year-old girl had just set in motion a chain of events that would strip away every layer of protection he'd built around himself. He had no idea that her second and third wishes would be even more devastating than the first. All he knew as he sat in his expensive leather chair and stared at his reflection in the darkened window was that for the first time in years he felt afraid. And in the kitchen, Lily returned to her homework, a small, knowing smile on her face. The weekend passed like a countdown to execution. Richard spent Saturday and Sunday in a state of growing dread, unable to focus on anything except what Monday would bring. He canceled his golf game. He ignored calls from business associates. He sat in his penthouse and stared at the city below, wondering how he'd allowed a child to manipulate him into this absurd situation. On Sunday evening, Patricia arrived with a small duffel bag and an envelope. Her face was still swollen, the infection clearly worse, but she maintained her professional composure as she handed him the items. Mr. Calloway, she said quietly, Lily asked me to bring you these. The bag has clothes from the donation center, the kind people in minimum wage jobs wear. The envelope has your instructions. She hesitated, then added, Sir, you don't have to do this. Lily is just a child, she doesn't understand what she's asking. Richard took the bag and envelope, feeling their weight like chains. I gave my word, he said, the words tasting bitter. I'll see it through. After Patricia left, he opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten note in careful, childish script and several items that made his stomach drop. A bus pass, $73 in small bills, an address in a part of the city he'd never visited, and the note written in Lily's precise handwriting. Mr. Calloway, here are the rules for your first wish. You will live at this address for 7 days. It's a studio apartment that costs $500 a month. You have been given the amount of money someone making minimum wage would have left after paying rent, utilities, and transportation for 1 week. That's $73 for food and everything else. Your phone will be taken away. You cannot contact anyone from your old life. You cannot use your credit cards or bank accounts. You will work at Sam's Diner on 5th Street. They're expecting someone named Rick Miller to start Monday morning. You will work 8-hour shifts for minimum wage. At the end of 7 days, if you complete this wish honestly, I will tell you my second wish. If you cheat or quit, the deal is off and everyone will know that Richard Calloway's promises mean nothing. The choice is yours. Richard read the note 3 times, each reading making his hands shake more. This wasn't a child's prank. This was a carefully constructed trap designed to humiliate him, to strip away everything that made him who he was. He could refuse. He should refuse. But something stopped him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe, buried beneath years of carefully constructed indifference, there was a tiny part of him that wondered if the girl was right, if he really had become something hollow and false. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Richard, dressed in the donated clothes, jeans that were slightly too big and a plain blue shirt that had clearly been worn by many people before him. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Without his expensive suits, his carefully styled hair products, his designer watch, he looked ordinary, forgettable, poor. The transformation terrified him. He left his penthouse at 6 in the morning before anyone could see him like this. The address Lily had given him was in a neighborhood called Riverside, a name that promised something pleasant but delivered something else entirely. The bus ride took 45 minutes and Richard spent every minute of it surrounded by people he'd never truly seen before. Working people, tired people, people who smelled like cheap soap and yesterday's worries. A woman next to him held a baby that cried the entire trip. Across from him, a man in a janitor's uniform slept with his head against the window, his body swaying with the bus's movements. Two teenagers argued about someone named Carlos who owed someone money. The bus was loud, cramped, and smelled like a mixture of cleaning products and human exhaustion. Richard kept his eyes down, counting the minutes until he could escape. The apartment building was worse than he'd imagined. It was a 5-story structure with crumbling brick and windows covered in bars. The front door didn't lock properly. The hallway smelled like mold and something he didn't want to identify. His apartment was on the 3rd floor and the elevator had an out-of-order sign that looked permanently attached. By the time he climbed the stairs and unlocked the door to apartment 3C, Richard was already considering abandoning this entire foolish experiment. Then he stepped inside and felt his resolve crumble further. The studio apartment was smaller than his walk-in closet. One room served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen. A tiny bathroom was visible through a partially open door, revealing stained tiles and a shower curtain covered in mildew. The furniture consisted of a sagging mattress on a metal frame, a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a countertop with a hot plate and a mini fridge that hummed like it was dying. The window looked out onto an alley where dumpsters overflowed with trash. There was no air conditioning, just a fan that rattled when it turned. The walls were thin enough that Richard could hear his neighbors, a couple arguing in Spanish on one side and a television blaring game shows on the other. This was where he would live for 7 days. Richard sat on the edge of the mattress and put his head in his hands. He'd never felt more aware of what he'd taken for granted. Climate control, space, silence, cleanliness, safety, all the invisible comforts that money provided were suddenly brutally absent. He wanted to leave, he wanted to call his driver and return to his real life, but Lily's words echoed in his mind. Everyone will know that Richard Calloway's promises mean nothing. He stayed. At 7:30, Richard walked to Sam's Diner, a 15-minute journey through streets he'd only ever seen from the inside of his car. The diner was wedged between a laundromat and a check cashing place, its windows covered in faded signs advertising breakfast specials. Inside, the smell of old grease and burnt coffee hit him like a physical wall. A heavy-set man with a stained apron looked up from behind the counter. "You Rick Miller." Richard opened his mouth to correct him, then remembered, Rick Miller, his name for the next week. "Yes," he said, the lie feeling strange on his tongue. "I'm Sam. You ever worked in a restaurant before?" "No." Sam grunted, unsurprised. "Figures. Patricia said you were down on your luck, needed work fast. Fine, minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. You work 8-hour shifts 6 days this week. You get a 30-minute break, you eat 1 meal free per shift, nothing fancy. You bus tables, wash dishes, whatever I need. You show up late, you're fired. You steal, you're fired. You give me attitude, you're fired. We clear." Richard nodded. Not trusting himself to speak, $7.25 per hour, he spent more than that on coffee. "Good, put this on." Sam tossed him an apron that might have been white once but was now a gray-brown color. "Table 4 needs clearing." The next 8 hours were the longest of Richard's life. He cleared tables, scraping congealed eggs and soggy toast into trash bins. He washed dishes in water so hot it burned his hands, which weren't used to manual labor. He mopped floors that got dirty again minutes later. He took orders from Sam, who barked commands like a drill sergeant and criticized everything Richard did too slowly, too clumsily, too expensively. "Move faster, Rick, we got customers waiting. Those dishes ain't gonna wash themselves. You call that clean, do it again." By noon, Richard's back ached. His hands were raw and wrinkled from dishwater, his feet throbbed in the cheap shoes he'd been given, and he still had 4 more hours to go. During his 30-minute break, he sat in the alley behind the diner, too exhausted to even eat the sandwich Sam had grudgingly made him. A stray cat watched him from behind a dumpster, its ribs showing through matted fur. Richard looked at the cat and felt a disturbing kinship. They were both surviving in a world that didn't care if they lived or died. When he returned to work, the afternoon rush hit. The diner filled with people, construction workers in dusty clothes, nurses still wearing scrubs from the hospital, delivery drivers grabbing quick meals between runs. They all looked tired. They all looked like they were counting their money carefully, choosing the cheapest items on the menu, asking for water instead of soda to save $1. Richard watched them and realized something that made him feel sick. These were the people he'd been helping with his donations. These were the people he'd posed with for photo opportunities, smiling his empty smile while promising to make their lives better. But he'd never actually seen them before, not really. They'd been props in his performance of generosity, faceless recipients of his charitable goodwill. Now he was one of them, and the view from this side was devastating. At 4 o'clock, Sam handed him his first day's pay in cash, $58 after taxes. Richard stared at the bills in his hand, unable to process that he'd just worked 8 hours for this amount. He'd spent more than this on appetizers at restaurants. He'd tipped parking attendants more than this. "Same time tomorrow," Sam said, already turning away. "Don't be late." Richard walked back to his apartment through streets that felt different now. Every person he passed was carrying the same exhaustion he felt. Every face told a story of struggle he'd never bothered to read. By the time he climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, his legs were shaking. Inside, he collapsed on the mattress and stared at the ceiling, where a water stain had formed the shape of something that might have been a face or might have been his imagination. The couple next door was arguing again, their voices rising and falling like waves. The game show television was playing a commercial for a personal injury lawyer. Richard took out the $73 Lily had given him, added his day's pay, and tried to calculate how he would survive 6 more days. Food. He needed food. The mini fridge was empty. He was hungry, genuinely hungry in a way he couldn't remember being before. He walked to the corner store, a small bodega with bars on the windows and flickering fluorescent lights. Everything was more expensive than he expected. A loaf of bread was $3, peanut butter was $5, a gallon of milk was $4.50. He did the math in his head, calculating like he'd never calculated before, trying to figure out how to feed himself for 6 days on the money he had. He bought bread, peanut butter, a pack of instant noodles, and a carton of eggs. Total cost, $19. He walked back to his apartment, clutching the plastic bag like it contained treasures, because in this moment it did. That night, Richard ate a peanut butter sandwich and tried not to think about the 5-course meals his private chef usually prepared. He tried not to think about his king-sized bed with its Egyptian cotton sheets. He tried not to think about the silence and space of his penthouse. Instead, he thought about Patricia, about how she did this every day, not for a week but for years. About how she'd asked for $800 to fix a dangerous infection and he'd told her to stop wasting money. About the casual cruelty of his response, delivered without a second thought because her pain had been invisible to him. He thought about all the people he'd photographed himself with, the sick children and grateful families, and wondered how many of them had gone home to apartments like this. How many had chosen between medicine and food? How many had worked themselves to exhaustion for wages that barely kept them alive? The thoughts kept him awake long after the television next door went silent and the arguing couple finally stopped. Somewhere around midnight, lying on a mattress that smelled like other people's lives, Richard Calloway began to understand what Lily had done to him. She hadn't punished him, she'd opened his eyes. The next 5 days blurred together in a haze of physical exhaustion and growing awareness. Each day followed the same brutal pattern. Wake up in the too-hot apartment, walk to the diner, work 8 hours doing jobs he'd never imagined doing, collect his meager pay, buy the cheapest food possible, return to the apartment, and collapse into dreamless sleep. But within that repetition, things happened that changed him in ways he couldn't have predicted. On Tuesday, he met Maria, a single mother who worked the morning shift at the diner. She had 3 children and worked 2 jobs, sleeping only 4 hours a night. She was always cheerful, always singing in Spanish while she cleaned tables, always sharing her food with anyone who looked hungry. When Richard's hands got burned on a hot plate and he yelped in pain, she was the one who pulled him aside and showed him how to wrap them in wet towels. "You get used to it," she said kindly, her English accented but clear. "The burns, the aching feet, the exhaustion, you get used to it or you don't survive, but you have to find joy somewhere, otherwise what's the point?" Richard looked at this woman who had every reason to be bitter and broken, and she was singing. She was sharing her lunch. She was taking care of him, a stranger, because that's what people did in this world. They helped each other because no one else would. On Wednesday, his neighbor, the woman from the arguing couple, knocked on his door. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 25, with bruises on her arms she tried to hide with long sleeves. She asked if he had any food to spare. Her boyfriend had left with all their money and she hadn't eaten in 2 days. Richard gave her half of what he had, watching her cry with gratitude over a loaf of bread and some eggs. She told him her name was Jennifer, that she was trying to save money to leave, that she was scared and alone. He sat with her in the hallway for an hour, listening to her story, unable to offer solutions because he had none. He was as powerless as she was, and that helplessness was terrifying. On Thursday, Sam's daughter came to the diner. She was 6 years old, small and thin, with her father's eyes. She sat in a booth doing homework while Sam worked, and Richard noticed she was wearing shoes that were too small. When he mentioned it to Sam during a break, the big man's face went hard. "Yeah, I know," Sam said gruffly. "Her feet grew, kids do that, but new shoes are $50 I don't have right now. The rent went up last month and my wife's car broke down, we're behind on everything. She'll make do with those shoes until I can save enough, she's tough, she'll be fine." Richard watched Sam's daughter that afternoon, saw how she walked carefully to avoid putting pressure on the front of her too small shoes, and felt rage building inside him. Not at Sam, but at a system that forced a man who worked 60 hours a week to choose between his daughter's comfort and his family's survival. At a world where children suffered because shoes cost $50 their parents didn't have. On Friday, Richard got sick. He woke up with a fever and body aches, probably from exhaustion and stress. He couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't afford to lose a day's pay, so he went to the diner anyway. He worked his shift in a fog of misery, dropping dishes and moving slowly until Sam finally noticed. "You look terrible, Rick, you sick." "I'll be fine," Richard said, though he was shaking. "No, you won't. Go home, rest." "But I need the money." "Go home," Sam said firmly. "I'm not running a sweatshop. You work sick, you'll just get worse and then you'll be out longer. Go, I'll pay you for half the shift." Richard walked home in a daze, Sam's unexpected kindness almost breaking him. He spent the rest of the day in bed, too sick to eat, too miserable to sleep properly. No one checked on him. No one brought him medicine. He was alone with his illness in a way he'd never experienced before, without the safety net of doctors on call or staff to care for him. He survived because his body fought off whatever had infected him, and by Saturday morning he was weak but functional. He returned to work and found Maria had saved him food from her own lunch, and Sam had kept his job available without complaint. These were the people Richard had spent his life looking past. These were the individuals he'd reduced to statistics in his charitable donations, and they had more genuine compassion in their exhausted bones than he'd shown in his entire privileged life. Saturday night, his last night in the apartment, Richard sat at the small table with his final meal, instant noodles that cost 89 cents. He'd made it through the week with $11 remaining. $11, the price of survival measured in single digits. He thought about the man he'd been 7 days ago, standing in his penthouse with his expensive coffee, dismissing Patricia's pain with casual indifference. He wanted to hate that man, but he couldn't because that man was still him. The same person, just with his eyes finally open. On Sunday morning, as instructed, he returned to his penthouse. The building's doorman looked startled to see him in cheap clothes, dirty and exhausted, but didn't comment. Richard took the private elevator up, each floor feeling like ascending from hell back to heaven, though heaven felt different now, tainted, unearned. His apartment was exactly as he'd left it, perfect, clean, empty. Patricia was there preparing his breakfast as she always did. Her face was less swollen, he noticed. Somehow she'd found a way to get her tooth fixed. When she saw him, she stopped working and simply looked at him, searching his face for something. "Did you complete the week, Mr. Calloway?" she asked softly. "Yes," Richard said, his voice rough from disuse and exhaustion. "I completed it." Patricia nodded slowly. "Lily will be here this afternoon. She said to tell you that if you kept your word, she would tell you her second wish then." Richard sank into his leather chair, the one that had cost thousands of dollars, and felt somehow both more and less comfortable than the broken furniture he'd been using. "Tell her I'll be waiting," he said. And he would be, because despite the exhaustion, despite the humiliation, despite everything this week had cost him, Richard knew something fundamental had shifted inside him. The girl had been right, he'd needed to see, he'd needed to understand. But he also knew with a growing sense of dread that Lily's second wish would be even harder than the first, because she wasn't finished with him yet, she was just getting started. And as Richard sat in his expensive chair in his expensive apartment, surrounded by all the markers of his success, he felt more exposed and vulnerable than he had in the cramped studio with $11 in his pocket. Because poverty, he'd learned, was just the first lesson. The real education was yet to come. Lily arrived at 3 o'clock that afternoon, and Richard was shocked by how nervous he felt waiting for her. He'd showered, changed into his own clothes, but somehow the expensive fabric felt wrong now, like a costume he was wearing. He tried to eat the elaborate lunch Patricia had prepared, but the food tasted too rich too much after a week of instant noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. When Patricia brought her daughter into the living room, Richard stood up without thinking, a gesture of respect he couldn't remember ever showing a child before. Lily was wearing the same hand-me-down clothes, her hair in the same simple ponytail, but she looked different to him now, or maybe he was the one who had changed. "Hello, Mr. Calloway," Lily said, her voice as calm and observant as ever. "You completed the week." "I did," Richard said, his throat felt tight. "You were right about everything. I needed to see what life is really like for people who work for minimum wage. I needed to understand." He paused, then added quietly, "Thank you." Lily tilted her head slightly, studying him with those sharp eyes. "You're thanking me?" "Yes, you showed me something I needed to see, something I'd been avoiding my whole life." "And what did you see?" Richard sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted despite having slept in his own bed the night before. "I saw people working harder than I've ever worked, for wages that barely keep them alive. I saw dignity in places I never thought to look for it. I saw kindness from people who had nothing to spare. And I saw myself clearly for the first time. I saw how cruel I've been, how blind, how willing to help from a distance while ignoring the suffering right in front of me." He looked at Patricia, who was standing by the doorway, her hand over her mouth. "I'm sorry, Patricia, for what I said about your tooth, for how I dismissed your pain. I'm sorry for every time I've made you feel invisible. You deserved better than that. You deserve better than me." Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Lily watched this exchange carefully, then nodded as if Richard had passed some kind of test. "My mother got her tooth fixed," Lily said. "A woman named Maria from the diner helped arrange it. She knew a dentist who does charity work one weekend a month. My mother had to wait in line for 7 hours, but he fixed it for free. That's what real help looks like, Mr. Calloway. Not a $5 million donation with cameras and reporters. Just one person taking time to help another person because it's the right thing to do." Richard felt the words like a punch to his chest, but he nodded. "You're right, I understand that now." "Do you?" Lily's voice was gentle but skeptical. "Or do you just understand poverty a little better? That was only the first lesson, Mr. Calloway. Understanding what it's like to be poor is important, but it's not enough, because there are things worse than being poor." Richard felt his mouth go dry. "What do you mean?" Lily walked to the window and looked out at the city, at the view that cost millions of dollars. When she turned back to face him, there was something profound in her young face, something that spoke of experience no child should have. "Being poor is hard," she said, "but being invisible is worse. Being treated like you don't matter, like your feelings and thoughts and dreams aren't important because you don't have money. That's what breaks people, Mr. Calloway, not the lack of things but the lack of dignity, the lack of being seen." She paused, letting her words settle in the air like stones dropping into water. "Which brings me to my second wish." Richard's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "I'm listening." "My second wish," Lily said clearly, "is that you spend one full week working as a volunteer at Mercy General Hospital in the Children's Cancer Ward. The same hospital you donated $5 million to. But you won't go as Richard Calloway, billionaire donor. You'll go as Rick Miller, volunteer. You'll work with the sick children, you'll sit with the families, you'll help the nurses and doctors with whatever they need. You'll see where your money actually goes and meet the people you claim to help. But here's the most important part: you cannot tell anyone who you really are. You cannot use your name or your influence to make things easier. You have to experience what it's like to serve without recognition, to help without applause. That's my second wish." Richard stared at her, his mind racing. Of all the things he'd expected, this wasn't it. "The Children's Cancer Ward," he repeated slowly. "Yes, the place you posed for pictures. The place you smiled for cameras and talked about your deep commitment to helping sick children. Now you'll actually help them without any cameras or reporters or people thanking you for your generosity. You'll just be another volunteer doing difficult work that no one will praise you for." "That's not punishment," Richard said quietly. "That's actually meaningful work." "I know," Lily said. "That's the point. Your first wish taught you about poverty. Your second wish will teach you about purpose. About what it means to help people because they need help, not because it makes you look good." Richard felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation. The cancer ward, sick children, families in crisis. It would be heartbreaking work, exhausting work, the kind of emotional labor he'd always avoided by writing checks instead. But he'd given his word. "When do I start?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Lily said. "The volunteer coordinator is expecting Rick Miller to begin Monday morning. You'll work 8-hour shifts 5 days this week. Patricia has your schedule and instructions." Richard nodded slowly, "And at the end of the week?" "At the end of the week, if you complete this wish honestly, I'll tell you my third and final wish. Then you'll be free of your promise." "Free," Richard repeated, and the word sounded strange. Because despite the difficulty, despite the exhaustion and humiliation and pain of the past week, he wasn't sure he wanted to be free. Something was happening to him, something important, and Lily was the guide leading him through it. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "I'll complete your second wish." Lily smiled then, a real smile that transformed her serious face. "Good, because Mr. Calloway, the children need you, not your money, you, the person underneath all that wealth, and I think maybe you need them too." After Lily and Patricia left, Richard sat alone in his penthouse and thought about what awaited him. He'd visited Mercy General exactly once, for the donation ceremony. He'd spent 45 minutes there, most of it in a conference room with administrators, 10 minutes in the cancer ward for photos. He'd posed with 3 children, all carefully selected because they were well enough to smile and sick enough to look sympathetic. He remembered none of their names. The memory made him feel sick with shame. That night he barely slept. He kept thinking about what Lily had said. Being invisible is worse than being poor. He'd made people invisible his entire life, reducing them to statistics and photo opportunities, never seeing them as fully human. The thought was unbearable now. Monday morning arrived with gray skis and the threat of rain. Richard dressed in simple clothes again, jeans and a plain shirt, and took a taxi to Mercy General. He'd thought about taking the bus, maintaining his Rick Miller persona, but Lily hadn't specified that requirement this time. Maybe because this lesson was about something else, something deeper. The hospital was a massive complex, all glass and steel and the antiseptic smell that clung to medical facilities. Richard entered through the main doors and found his way to the volunteer office, where a tired-looking woman named Helen checked him in. "Rick Miller?" she asked, barely looking up from her computer. "Yes, ma'am." "You're assigned to the pediatric oncology ward, 7th floor. Have you worked with sick children before?" "No." Helen finally looked at him, her eyes assessing. "It's difficult work, emotionally draining. Some volunteers can't handle it and quit after a few days. The children are very sick. Some of them won't get better. You need to understand that going in." "I understand," Richard said, though he didn't, not really. "You'll be helping however the nurses need you, restocking supplies, keeping rooms clean, sitting with children whose families can't be there all the time. Sometimes you'll just be a friendly face. Sometimes you'll be holding a hand while a child goes through something painful. Can you handle that?" Richard thought about running, about using his real name and influence to get assigned somewhere easier, but he didn't. "I'll handle it," he said. Helen handed him a volunteer badge and a folder with information. "7th floor, ask for Nurse Catherine, she'll show you what to do, and Rick, thank you for volunteering, these kids need all the help they can get." The elevator ride to the 7th floor felt like descending into something profound. When the doors opened, Richard stepped into a world that smelled like medicine and hope and sorrow all mixed together. The walls were painted bright colors, covered with drawings and encouraging messages. A sign read, "Pediatric Oncology, where courage lives." Nurse Catherine was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She looked Richard up and down when he introduced himself, and he had the feeling she could see right through people. "New volunteer," she said, not quite a question. "First time in a cancer ward?" "Yes." "Then I'll be direct. These children are fighting for their lives. They're scared, they're in pain, they're dealing with treatments that make them feel worse before they feel better. Some of them are going to die despite everything we do. Your job is to make their days a little brighter, a little easier. You'll see things that will break your heart. You cannot let that stop you from showing up. Understood?" "Understood." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "Good, let's start with something simple, come with me." She led him to a supply room and showed him how to restock the carts that held medical supplies. It was mindless work, organizing bandages and gauze and antiseptic wipes, but Richard found himself grateful for it. It gave him time to hear the sounds of the ward. Children crying, parents comforting, nurses moving efficiently between rooms. the steady beep of monitors tracking heartbeats and medication. After an hour, Catherine found him again, ready to meet some patients. Richard's heart pounded. Yes. The first room she took him to held a boy named Danny who was 8 years old and had been fighting leukemia for 2 years. He was completely bald from chemotherapy, thin to the point of being skeletal with dark circles under his eyes. But when Richard entered the room, the boy smiled. Hi, are you a new volunteer? What's your name? Rick, Richard said, his voice catching slightly. What's yours? I'm Danny. Do you like video games? Because I'm really good at them and I need someone to play with. My mom had to go to work and the nurses are too busy. Richard looked at this child who should have been outside playing, who should have been worried about homework and friends, not cancer and chemotherapy. I like video games, he lied. He'd never played one in his life. Danny's face lit up. Really? Awesome, come on, I'll teach you. For the next hour, Richard sat beside Danny's hospital bed and learned how to play a racing game on a small console. He was terrible at it, crashing constantly, and Danny laughed every time, a sound so pure and joyful it made Richard's chest ache. Between races, Danny talked about his life, about how he missed school and his friends, about how the treatment made him throw up but the doctors said it was working. About how he was going to be a doctor himself when he grew up, so he could help other kids like him. You're going to be a doctor? Richard asked. Yeah, because I know what it's like to be sick, so I'll be extra nice to my patients. I'll understand what they're feeling. Richard thought about all the doctors he'd met at fundraisers, successful professionals who'd never been seriously ill. Danny, at 8 years old, already understood something profound about empathy and purpose. You'll be a great doctor, Danny, Richard said, his voice thick. Thanks, Rick, you're cool. Will you come back and play again tomorrow? Yes, Richard promised, I'll come back. The rest of the day followed a similar pattern. Catherine introduced him to child after child, each one fighting their own battle with cancer. There was Sophie, 6 years old, who was having a bad reaction to her treatment and couldn't stop crying. Richard sat with her and read stories until she finally fell asleep, her small hand clutching his. There was Michael, 13, angry at the world, who yelled at Richard to leave him alone, and Richard stayed anyway, sitting silently until Michael finally started talking about how scared he was. There was little Emma, just 4 years old, who'd lost all her hair and asked Richard if he thought she was still pretty. Richard told her she was beautiful and meant it with every fiber of his being. By the time his shift ended at 5 o'clock, Richard was emotionally destroyed. He'd seen more suffering in 8 hours than in his entire 42 years of life. He'd held hands and wiped tears and heard stories that would haunt him forever. And not once had anyone thanked him for his $5 million donation. Not once had anyone recognized him as anyone important. He was just Rick, a volunteer who showed up and did what was needed. In the hospital parking lot, Richard sat in his car and cried for the first time since he was a child. He cried for Danny and his dreams of being a doctor. He cried for Sophie and her pain. He cried for all the children fighting battles they shouldn't have to fight. And he cried for himself for all the years he'd wasted being blind to this suffering while pretending to care. The next 4 days were both harder and easier than the first. Harder because each day brought new heartbreak. He watched children go through painful procedures. He sat with families who were making impossible decisions. He saw kids who'd been smiling one day, gone the next, their rooms empty except for the drawings they'd left behind. But it was also easier because he began to understand what Lily had meant about purpose. When he helped Sophie feel better, when he made Danny laugh, when he gave Michael someone to talk to, he felt something he'd never felt before. Not satisfaction, not pride, but something deeper. Connection. Meaning. The sense that he mattered not because of what he owned but because of what he gave of himself. On Wednesday, he met a mother named Alicia whose daughter Rosa had been in the hospital for 3 months. Rosa was 9 and her prognosis wasn't good. The doctors had said there was nothing more they could do. Alicia sat beside her daughter's bed around the clock, leaving only to use the bathroom or grab food from the cafeteria. Richard brought Alicia coffee during his break, and she looked at him with exhausted gratitude. Thank you, she said. You're the volunteer, right, Rick? Yes, ma'am. You've been good with Rosa. She talks about you, says you're funny. Richard thought about the silly voices he'd been doing while reading stories, something he'd never imagined himself doing. She's a special girl. She is, Alicia said, her voice breaking. She's my whole world and I'm losing her. The doctors say it's just a matter of time now, weeks, maybe days, and there's nothing I can do except be here with her. Richard sat down next to Alicia, and for once in his life he didn't try to fix things or offer solutions. He just listened. I keep thinking about all the what-ifs, Alicia continued. What if we'd caught it earlier? What if we'd had better insurance and could have afforded different treatments? What if I'd worked less and spent more time noticing the signs? I know it's not my fault, the doctors told me that, but I can't stop wondering if I could have changed things. You're here with her now, Richard said quietly. That's what matters. She's not alone. She has her mother who loves her more than anything. Alicia nodded, tears streaming down her face. I just wish I could do more. I wish I could take her pain. I wish I could trade places with her. What kind of world makes children suffer like this? Richard had no answer. He'd spent his life thinking money could solve everything, but money couldn't cure Rosa. Money couldn't take away Alicia's pain. Money was worthless here in this room where a mother was losing her daughter. That afternoon, Richard sat with Rosa while Alicia went to make phone calls. Rosa was drifting in and out of consciousness, the medication keeping her comfortable. During a moment of clarity, she opened her eyes and looked at Richard. Hi Rick, she whispered. Hi Rosa, how are you feeling? Tired, really tired, but I wanted to tell you something. What's that? Thank you for being nice to my mom. She's really sad and you make her feel better, that's important. Richard felt his throat close up. This child who was dying was worried about her mother. Your mom loves you very much. I know, that's why I feel bad. I don't want her to be sad when I'm gone. She'll be sad because you're special, Rosa, because you matter, that's what love is. Rosa smiled faintly. Will you stay with her after? She'll need friends. Richard held her small, cold hand. I'll make sure she's not alone, I promise. Okay, that's good. Rosa's eyes closed again. You're a good person, Rick. Those words from a dying 9-year-old meant more to Richard than any award or recognition he'd ever received. He sat with Rosa until Alicia returned, and he kept his promise. Even after his volunteer hours were over, he stayed, supporting this mother who was living through every parent's worst nightmare. Rosa died on Thursday night peacefully, with her mother holding one hand and Richard holding the other. Alicia wept, and Richard wept with her, no longer afraid of showing emotion, no longer hiding behind walls of indifference. Friday, his last day, Richard moved through the hospital in a daze of grief and exhaustion. But he showed up. He read stories to Danny, he played games with Michael, he helped the nurses and supported the families and did all the small, invisible things that needed doing. At the end of his shift, Nurse Catherine pulled him aside. Rick, you did good work this week, better than most volunteers who have never been around sick children. You showed up, you cared, and you weren't afraid to be present with the difficult stuff. That takes courage. Thank you, Richard said. This week changed me. I could see it, Catherine said. You came in looking like you'd never been uncomfortable a day in your life. You're leaving looking like you've lived. That's what this place does. It strips away everything that doesn't matter and shows you what does. Richard nodded, unable to speak. Will you come back? Catherine asked. Not as part of whatever brought you here, but because you want to. Yes, Richard said without hesitation, I'll come back. That evening, back in his penthouse, Richard stood at his window and looked out at the city. The view was the same, but he was different. He'd spent a week surrounded by suffering and courage and love so powerful it transcended death. He'd seen people face impossible situations with dignity. He'd witnessed what it meant to truly help someone, not with money or grand gestures, but with presence and time and genuine care. Lily had been right. The first wish taught him about poverty. The second taught him about purpose. He'd learned that being seen, being acknowledged as human, mattered more than material comfort. He'd learned that showing up, being present, offering yourself without expecting recognition or reward was the most valuable thing anyone could do. And now, as he waited for Lily to return with her third wish, Richard knew that whatever she asked of him, he would do it. Not because he'd made a promise, though that still mattered, but because she was teaching him how to be human again, how to see others, how to matter in ways that actually counted. The penthouse felt emptier than ever, all his possessions suddenly meaningless. But Richard felt fuller, more present, more alive than he'd been in decades. The transformation wasn't complete, he knew that. 1 week of poverty and 1 week of service couldn't undo 42 years of indifference. But it was a start. And whatever Lily's final wish would be, Richard was ready to face it, because he was finally beginning to understand that the girl wasn't punishing him. She was saving him,